Joining me today is Professor Wilfred Reilly. This is the third time that we've had a discussion, and he's always extremely on point and entertaining, and you learn a lot from him. And every time I have him on the various shows, no matter how long the segment is, it's never enough. You know, you have him on for one segment, two segment, and I'm like, man, we needed more time. Well, he's here for the whole hour, so hopefully we're able to change that a bit. He is an associate professor of political science at Kentucky State University and the author of books Hate, Crime, Hoax, and Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. Follow him on Twitter at WillTheBeast630. Will, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be back.
Well, whenever we talk, we always cover such a wide range of topics. We can talk about everything, and, you know, that's a good thing for the radio, but it makes it a little difficult to narrow down what the conversation was going to be about. And then you saved me this week on this past Tuesday. The USA Today posted your article, "I Saw Identity Politics Tear the Occupy Movement Apart. Economic leftists must ditch wokeness." Tell the listeners what you meant by that.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you get right down to it, the foundation of kind of a politics that makes sense is often either economic or cultural. It's not based, just around anger. So traditionally, the Republicans have been the Main Street party. They've been the party of the businessman, small businessman, farmer, military officer. And the Democrats have been perhaps the Union Party. They've been the party of working people. Their motto, I believe, is still the People's Party. And there's nothing really wrong with any of that. That was the political fight for probably 50, 60 years with some things like women's rights mixed in. Mm-hmm. And what we're seeing right now on the left, and I don't think the right has really had this problem since maybe the moral majority days in the late 1970s, early 1980s. But what we're seeing on the left is the core mission, which is sort of class-based rights, whether we agree with them or not, healthcare, so on, being torn apart by a lot of this internal fighting about identity. So you see a lot of people promoting, for example, fairly radical trans issues. This seems to be the big thing today, transition for kids and so on. You see a lot of focus on how no white person can understand the black experience, the feminist experience. There are now 58 genders that are recognized by Facebook and Twitter. And you don't want to get glib with this, but it actually is a serious problem if you're a leftist. I'm not, fortunately. But when I was in college, I was pretty active with the Occupy movement, the people running around with the Guy Fawkes face masks on, demanding money from the rich. And one of the things that I saw very quickly was that even the movement's legitimate goals, like a higher Illinois minimum wage, were compromised by all of the internal divisions within that group. So whenever we would actually get organized and we'd call for a commission on something, rounding up the people that would meet with the deputy mayor to talk about minimum wage increases, the first thing that would happen is that someone would say, well, before we get together, we need a women's meeting to work out what our position is. And then the call would come for a black women's meeting. What about a black gay women's meeting? And by the end, nothing would ever get done. You had 30 different positions from people based on their race, their sex, their orientation, age. And I think that's what you're seeing in the Democratic Party to some extent today. And if those guys want to really achieve anything, national health care comes to mind, there's going to have to be some kind of a leash put on this idea that no white man can ever understand what a black woman wants in terms of their doctor and so on. So that was the thrust of the article, that constantly focusing on all these small personal identities breaks up movements. It makes it very difficult for countrymen to work together and do anything.
Well, that's a mouthful, but 100% true. And what's fascinating to me about it is that, like you say, we have kind of a similar approach in that you don't have to agree with everyone, but you're an intellectual guy and you're open to whatever the argument may be, as long as you can make it in a rational manner. And you don't have to be on the left to understand that. What fascinates me, though, is in the article you bring up the Bernie Sanders thing. And what surprises me is if you give them their argument, because that's the way I usually approach these things. I think too many people on the right want to argue and yell at somebody and say you're always wrong and call them dumb and say whatever. It's like, no, give them their argument. Let's have that debate. So if you really want to fix those issues you talked about and you think things are unfair, Bernie was your guy. Bernie came out and said, hey, I want to fix this. The riches, they're squeezing people out, whether you agree with it or not. That was his argument. Yet he has such a hard time garnering black votes both times in 2016 and in 2020. Right. And it's like, why do you think that blacks and other minorities who are on the left don't see that Bernie's proletariat approach, as misguided as it is, includes them as well?
Well, if you look at some of the protesters that have interrupted Bernie events, like the Black Lives Matter women that came to, I believe, his major Seattle event and shut it down, what they say is that he doesn't talk enough about black issues. So what we're saying would be a positive, they view as a negative. The critique of Sanders was he talks all the time about poor people. He talks about us as Americans. He doesn't talk enough specifically about black issues. So that's not going to be our candidate. And this is this idea of intersectionality. So I think what I said earlier, it's a good point, but it was a little vague. To me, movements are useful when they have one simple definition and one simple goal. So, for example, feminism is a movement to improve conditions for women. And over the years, it was generally kind of assumed that if you were a woman and you were on the left, you would be a feminist, whether that is good or bad. In recent years, we've seen the rise of this concept of intersectionality, which is that you can't address any one problem without addressing every other problem that the left cares about. So you now see T-shirts saying things like, yo, feminism ain't nothing if you don't care about Muslim men, which is an actual shirt an ex-girlfriend of mine owns. And it's kind of a bizarre, I'm not making this up, it's kind of a bizarre point. Like, why would I be less of a woman if I don't care about Muslim males or gay men or something like that? But this was the argument against Bernie Sanders, that he talks about economics, but he doesn't have a specific piece of the platform that's, how economics affects the gay person, how economics affects the city kid, how economics affects the woman, the black person. And that's what he was criticized for. He was criticized for just talking about money.
Right. And I get that. And I'm going to get back to the intersectionality in a minute, because I yell to the people on the right about that. See, we'll get more into this later, but it's funny. See, Will describes himself as center right, and I don't call myself a Republican. But people come to us and just assume, especially in this climate, that if you don't want to burn down the White House with Trump in it, you're a Trumper. It's like everything is not black and white. And I don't disagree with everything liberals say. In fact, a lot of things the liberals used to argue for makes total sense. What we're missing is the people who are making these arguments today aren't liberals. And that's the point we're trying to make. And I'll get back to the intersectionality in a minute. But the Bernie thing is just key, because you're right. And that's the reason why they push back against them and they don't and they yell about it. But that's not really what's fascinating. I guess it's all emotional, but that's not really what fascinates me. What fascinates me is I get what you're saying, that, he keeps talking about the economics, but he's not talking about black economics. He's not talking about what we need here, there, or women or trans people need. But isn't their argument, which is not really true, but they're buying into their own stereotype, that blacks are suffering more than everybody else, that blacks are all poor, that blacks are all suffering from X, Y, Z. So if he's addressing it, by definition, isn't he addressing their plight as well?
Yeah, that's actually kind of what I'm saying, sort of better put. Like, I think if you are a lefty, you are someone that wants all boats to rise on the tide, so on. And there's some situations where that's a valuable perspective. My opinion is that what you should argue for is broad policies that help out everyone, because if your group is oppressed, by definition, they're going to be helped out the most. So, yeah, obviously, if black people were all poor, which isn't the case. Black average income is up at a personal level above 85% of average income for whites. Asians make more than whites. But if it were true that minorities were all oppressed, obviously something like a minimum wage hike would help all the oppressed minorities. But the intersectional idea is that's not enough. You need a black plan.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we will continue this conversation with Wilfred Reilly, political science professor. Political science professor at Kentucky State University. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. We are talking to Wilfred Reilly, political science professor at Kentucky State University and author of Hate Crime Hoax and Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. Give us a call at 312-642-5600 if you want to chime in on this identity politics and wokeness and maybe correct us a bit and tell us that maybe there's a positive at the end of this, or if you disagree with it like us, give us a call and let us know what we should do about it. Will, I told you when we came back I was going to mention something on intersectionality, and I want to hear your thoughts. I obviously talk to a lot of people on the right often, and like most people who are, logical, look at this stuff and they get mad and they roll their eyes and say it's all foolishness, which a lot of it is. But I tell them, with the deficit they have in fighting against the cultural shift and media and entertainment and corporations and all, which we'll get to, and all that stuff, they need pretty much every arrow in the quiver. And I think this is something that they can use. And they look at me like I'm crazy. But I say intersectionality, pretty much like your article says, it broke apart the Occupy movement. And everything else they try, if it's not linear focused on whatever the issue is, it gets sidetracked. And I say, it's almost like you got two enemies that want to attack you, but they don't really like each other. You set it up where they fight each other and you kind of step back. We see it in the Asian students in New York and then with the colleges who were suing because you had admission that was based solely on academic rigor, and then the black and Hispanic students come up and say it's not enough of us there, led by de Blasio here in New York, so we're just going to change the way we admit students. And they're like, hey, that's not fair, and who sided with them in their lawsuit, right? So I think you kind of need to stir that pot and point out, you can continue to point out why it's wrong, but also push the infighting, right? Because then it's harder for them to achieve what they're trying to achieve if they're fighting amongst themselves.
Yeah, I mean, from an amoral, strategic, kind of Machiavellian perspective, yeah, that's exactly accurate. I mean, one of the things that you notice, and I mean, my background, as you know, was in executive business before going into academia. I mean, if you look at this from a business or a military perspective, as you going against an opponent, yeah, one of the major weaknesses of the left coalition in the USA is that it's a coalition of the fringes. It's a bunch of groups that are clumped together by this idea that they're fighting against kind of the white man or the man in the suit, whatever the devil figure is. Right. But other than that, there's not that much shared agreement between them. I mean, there's not really anything that, for example, a traditional feminist and a transgender woman have in common on a lot of issues.
Right.
I mean, we mentioned Islam earlier. There's not a lot of shared ground between traditional Muslims and swingers, for example, or the LGBT community.
And excuse me, but that's a funny one, though, because you have, and that's a great example, because one of the best examples that aren't mentioned as much is the fact that you have, when the colleges were pushing the BDS movement, and you had all these pro-Palestinian, woke teenagers and the Muslim groups, together saying, yes, down with Israel, but you got gays on their side, and they're like, well, where I'm come from, this is how we treat gays.
Yeah, there's an odd kind of link between BDS and BDSM there. I mean, and all this, it is kind of funny if you're talking about this as a strategist for the other side, which is a position I've sometimes been in. I mean, like, for example, a more serious one, union workers and illegal immigrants. Mm-hmm. Like, there's absolutely nothing there except maybe for a few shared policy issues like healthcare that unites those groups. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, obviously there is some terrain that you can go into that you can kind of exploit when you see people walking around wearing, like, for example, another shirt, Allah is queer.
Right.
I mean, you can really start unpacking that. Like, you can ask your Muslim buddy, like, do you believe that?
Right.
Excuse me, I'm not asking you to discriminate against gay people, but do you believe that Allah is, and I definitely think that that's something you see a lot of in internet culture, where people, I mean, you can dismiss them as trolls or as just having fun trading darts with the guys on the left side, but where people frequently say this, like, why would my feminism be flawed if I don't support gay masculinity? Like, this just seems ridiculous. So, and one sentence here, actually, the whole left coalition exists only insofar as they can convince members that they do have one enemy. With us in the black community, that really comes down to acting as though 1960s racism never went away. Like, why wouldn't you vote for Trump, the big funny guy with the economic plan? Well, he's a racist.
Right, right. Exactly. And what it does is you ignore everything else. And that's what shocks me. I really don't care who people vote for. I don't get on the radio. You can listen to the tapes and sing Trump's praises. But what I do say is I find it fascinating that you are fighting. You say you have one fight. My number one fight is this: feminism, racism, whatever. And you're willing to ignore everything else. But I look at how you live. I have middle-class black friends, right, who have issues with pretty much taxes. They have issues with the culture sliding. They have issues with all this stuff. But they're like, if I have to vote against everything I believe to vote against that white man and vote for another white man, I'm okay. I'll roll with it. And it's like, do you realize what you're saying is what shocks me about that. But one other thing I want to say about the article, because in the next segment I want to get to your book, but we can go back and forth between the two. But you talk about these woke corporations and, how they virtue signal and the things that they do to appear that they're on the side of these woke people. But then in reality, when you pull back the layers of the effectiveness of what they're actually doing, it's not really the case. You want to talk about that a minute?
Yeah, sure. So what I'm saying, the thesis of the article is that a focus on these kind of sideline issues like public acceptance of bisexuality, not that there's anything wrong with that, but a focus on this kind of stuff, this constant intersectional discussion, really distracts from some of the core goals of the left, some of which, like, national railway system, national health care. I think even you and I might say, well, I disagree, but that's an adult political goal. This stuff distracts from it. One of the things that I've noticed that, again, I frankly find hilariously funny from that strategic business perspective is that corporations that in no way want to pay more taxes, want to give up their economic power, they're cool with the silly fringe stuff like pronouns in the bio and so on. So you get this weird situation where, like Nike, they're not hiking salaries for their American workers. I've already said they're not going to. They employ some pretty unfree workers overseas, if we want to be blunt. But they're all too willing. Yeah, they're all too willing to get the contract for those NBA shirts that say equality now.
And let's not forget celebrating Juneteenth.
No, but I mean, like, you wind up with this ridiculous situation where a shirt says Black Lives Matter, but it's made by slaves. Now, they're probably white or Asian slaves. But I mean, that is woke corporatism, where the company, like the Walmart Shining Sun logo one day comes out in rainbow colors. Right. That corporations are very cool with. What they're not cool with doing is providing healthcare benefits for all their workers or something like that. Right. So intersectionality to some extent is a distraction from the core economic issues. That in a sentence is the point. Like, does Walmart have a rainbow flag in front of every store? Sure. Do they have benefits? No.
Right. And some of these things, like you say, we joke about these and we roll our eyes and say it's silliness, like the rainbow instead of the sun for Walmart. But some of these things create more inequality. And is it really fairness that you want? Like I always say that most of the people on the left say they want equality, but they don't. What they want is justifiable inequality. And one example I have, like the Nike and all the other businesses being woke, is the food delivery apps, your DoorDash and all those places. And not only donating money to BLM or whatever, but they came out and said, you know what, companies, small businesses are struggling doing this COVID thing. And George Floyd got killed, and that was pretty bad. So what we're going to do is we're going to waive or discount the fees for black businesses who are restaurants, so you order from them. The rest of you people go kick rocks.
Yeah, and the crazy thing about this, the thing I'm going to keep emphasizing is this distinction that's being drawn by these woke corporatists between race and class. To a large extent, all of this is collusion between the white and the POC upper classes. So you're absolutely right. DoorDash promotes minority-owned businesses. But I mean, like, if you actually open up the app, one of the minority-owned businesses was P.F. Chang's.
Right.
I mean, like, there are a lot of Asian and black people that Jewish Americans are doing pretty well. So it's not like you're promoting small business. It's not like you're promoting the barbecue joint down the street, because that might very well be white owned. That would make sense. What you're doing is this sort of virtue signal where already you take your black partners and put them to the front of the line, but everyone's rich.
Exactly. Next, we're going to continue this conversation and discuss your book, Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. We're talking with Wilfred Reilly on The Charles Love Show, AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of the Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. We are talking to Wilfred Reilly, author and political science professor at Kentucky State University. And we're going to shift to your second book. I know you have Hate Crime Hoax, and we talked about that before, but the current book, Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. And I don't want to go through all of them because, you know, we want people to buy the book and all, but you had some interesting points there, and a couple of them I definitely highlighted. But some of the facts, right? Police aren't murdering black people. There is no war on people of color. Different groups perform differently, and racism didn't cause the new problems of today. So you want to give them a brief overview of these 10 things and why they're important for you to write about.
Sure. So as you said about yourself, I mean, I sometimes take on sacred cows on the left, sometimes on the right. But what this book does, and it focuses more on the left, is look at the question of whether the people that keep saying believe the science, trust the science, really know much of anything about science, really have science on their side. So what I do in this book, some of which builds on pre-existing research by people like Heather McDonald, Roland Fryer, but some of which is pretty new, is look at some of the questions that are very prominent in sort of mainstream mass media. Are the police killing black people on a large scale? Is there a great deal of interracial crime really on either side, as you read these stories about Barbecue Becky and George Zimmerman and so on down the line? And then beyond this, to these deeper questions, does racism explain, for example, differences in the groups represented across elite college programs, across professional sport, and so on down the line? So, I mean, just starting with the first and the most obvious, I mean, I do look at this sort of Black Lives Matter question, the Breonna Taylor, Alton Sterling question. Are the cops murdering a ton of brothers, a lot of unarmed African Americans? Right. And obviously, as you said, you should buy and read the book, but the short answer is no. The total number of unarmed black men killed by police last year was 10. I believe there were 14 unarmed African Americans total. These numbers fluctuate a little bit. The Washington Post will update the list by one or two every so often. But you're talking about around 10 people. Mm-hmm. That's very typical. I mean, in the representative year of 2015, I do take a typical year and I break that down totally in this chapter. The total number of people, all races, all ages, killed by police was less than 1,200. This is out of 60 million stops. Of those, 258 individuals were African American, were black. You know, of those, the total number that year of unarmed, again, African American men killed by white police officers was 17. So you're talking about tiny, tiny numbers of people. I mean, this year, COVID-19 has been the cause of death, or at least part of the cause, for 250,000 people, cancer about 700,000, so on down the line. Mm-hmm. So that's chapter one. Chapter two looks at this broader question of, you know, whenever you turn on the media, you see these black-white stories of conflict, whether that's the knockout game, quote-unquote, on perhaps Newsmax, or whether that is, you know, black people being chased out of public parks on CNN or MSNBC. Is that realistic? And again, what I find is that, no, it's not. Interracial crime is about 5% of crime. In the most recent year on record, there were 12 million serious crimes. Of those, less than 600,000 were black on white or white on black violent offenses. Even more so, getting into that taboo topic, and I discussed this for 10, 15 pages, the large majority of interracial crime happens to be black on white. That's not even surprising in that there are more white people. There are 5 times as many whites, and they have more money. Right. But I mean, if you're a robber, you're not going to the hood. You're not going to the trailer park either. You're going downtown. But the whole idea that this is something that's targeting specifically African Americans is not true. We're the group least likely to be attacked interracially. So that's chapter 2. And then I get into the broader theme of the book, which is, sure, racism exists. But racism is what we would call one variable in a multivariate model. So if you're looking at something like college admissions, the reason those are slightly lower for black people isn't racism. In fact, that's insane. We benefit from affirmative action in that world. The reason is that there are these very specific gaps in test scores, for example, which, leaving aside racism, I don't think genetics plays much of a role. I mean, the key factor there is, the amount of time studying for tests. What do black kids do? What do white kids do? And then certainly, what do Asian kids do? So all of these ideas, these things you're not supposed to talk about. Is it racism that predicts success? Are the racists at war? Are the cops shooting young men, particularly black ones? All that's taken on. So are immigration and a bunch of other things.
Right. Oh, wow. When we come back, we will get more into that and talk about a few things I pulled from the book. But what I want you to think about before we get to the break is that those numbers are important. They're right. I write about it as well. There's a lot of great people who do. It's important for people to know that. But one other factor I like to add on to the fact is you're explaining the erroneous race factor, right? But I say, even if I take a step back, make it even more macro, it's important to point out that, let's be real, most people aren't robbing and killing each other. Right. So I was talking about the wealthies, and I said part of it is this perception across the board where people are like, you see the movies, you see the news, and you see a black man going to jail. You think black people are violent. And then you find out that really it's a really small percentage of anybody out of every racial group that are breaking the law. So over 95% of us are just law-abiding citizens. So we should focus on that as well. Back in a moment with Wilfred Reilly, political science professor, Kentucky State University. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. Here with Wilfred Reilly, author and political science professor at Kentucky State University. And when we left, we were discussing his latest book, Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. Follow him on Twitter at WillDeBeast630. So I was telling you my view on the additional number, I guess it is, on the crime stats that people analyze, and I think it's really important. I think I was on like one of the Fox shows, and I said, I think I need to make a T-shirt and just put on it, "We are the 97%," because in all those arguments, it's lost on the fact that so few, even blacks, people love to throw out that stat. Blacks are 6 times more likely to commit violent crime. One, you and I, because we study the numbers, know that number has been going down. Violent crime before this year had been going down across the board and faster in the black community. So now it's more like 2.5 or 3 to 1. But even when you say 6 to 1, I say you're leaving out a number. You're not giving me the full equation. Because what if the number for whites is 15%? Then that makes blacks 6 times 90%. You have an argument to say blacks are genetically violent people, but it's not. Do you know what the number is for whites? And people would look at me and say, no, I don't know. I said it's 0.25%. So it's really, really low for blacks and really, 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 really low for whites. The fact is, most people don't break the law. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I also will say that that 6X figure, that's only murder. Like that, right. The African American murder rate is 5.6 or whatever it is times the Caucasian murder rate, which is a problem we need to work on.
Right,
although I will say that there are substantially. Yeah, there are substantially higher suicide rates, fatal DUI rates, so on in the Caucasian community. So everyone has issues. We should work on them together as countrymen. For violent crime overall, the black crime rate, according to what's called the BJS, is only about 2.2 times the white crime rate. So again, we need to work on that, but that's not wildly epidemic. And yeah, what that means in practice is that 99% of whites, but 98% of blacks, or an even more specific figure you gave, aren't criminals. This actually, by the way, is something that people need to be aware of most of the time. Most data, wonky but real, most data is presented using a technique called backwards margin recording, where you note the difference and whether it's significant, but you don't note the actual figures. So CNN played this game recently. They ran a piece saying that babies are twice as likely to die, black babies, if they're cared for by a white doctor as by a black doctor. And again, like you said, when you see that, you think, my God, childbirth is dangerous. Is that 10% versus 20%? No, it turns out if you're a black mother and you have a black doctor, your child is 99.8% likely to live with no injuries. But if you have a Caucasian doctor, it's 99.7%. I think those are almost exactly the figures.
Right.
But technically, if you want to spin that and you want to get a story out there, you can say doctors of race X are twice as dangerous and incompetent as doctors of race Y, ignoring the fact that you're talking about the difference between 1 in 1,000 and 2 in 1,000. So yeah, this happens all the time. And the large majority of people are not criminals. The large majority of doctors or whatever race aren't guilty of malpractice. The media is guilty of malpractice. The present company, of course, accepted. But I mean, the media is this entity that thrives now on a click hit model. That's the media's business model today. So you get the most sensationalist stories possible out there. It's not Barbara Walters behind the desk anymore.
Right. It's funny because the last time we were on, I remember that when you talked about the media, we were talking, I think at the time we were right in the middle of the Jacob Blake shooting. Did we ever figure out how many times he got shot?
You were the first guy to point this out. I mentioned this to our criminal justice professor. We actually did some work on it. So thanks for being the originator there. It turns out he was hit twice, but he was shot at 7 times. So all of this gets into how you present things. Like in the Jacob Blake situation, I mean, this brother, frankly, was an accused rapist. He was at apparently the victim's house. Now, we don't want to demonize him. They also had a pre-existing relationship, so on. But the police were there because they got a rape call, or they got a call about a rape suspect at a woman's house. They showed up. He physically attacks a cop. There's a scuffle. Cop fires, strikes the target only twice, fight ends. The presentation of that in the press is going to be, the wildest possible spin on that. Like innocent man, because he hadn't yet been convicted, shot 7 times because that's the number of slugs that were fired, so on. And as long as you're aware of this kind of slant, it's not all that damaging. The problem is that a lot of people aren't aware of it.
Right. Most aren't. And I don't know, to add to that, I just was looking up the story and I saw 3 weeks ago, this is the other side. It's like the headlines and then people don't read the rest of the paper. Because he was charged with all this severe stuff, but then the shooting happens and that softens the views of him. Now they dropped and lowered some of the charges. So now he pleaded guilty, but it was to something, like trespassing and, something really minor. None of the rape charges. Because they're like, well, it looks bad. We shot the guy, so let him get off for rape. And these are the kind of things that these reactionary things that we're living in now.
Yeah, and I mean, you would have to imagine, like in terms of this specific case, that there's some conversation there behind the scenes. Like I don't want to malign the Blake family, but I mean, Jacob Blake, what did his GoFundMe get up to? $2.4 million.
Yeah,
he's in line. Yeah, it was in the millions. I know that. He's in line for a settlement that, if you look at similar cases, is going to be $6 to $8 million. So I wouldn't be surprised if he and the accuser reconciled. I mean, the last mention I saw of her in the press was as Jacob Blake's fiance now. So
wow. I did not see that.
We'll see what happens with that case.
Wow. This is awesome. Our last segment with Wilfred Reilly on the other side. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
return to the Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer. Once again, here's Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. Last segment with Wilfred Reilly, author, political science professor at Kentucky State University. He is phenomenal on Twitter. Follow him at WillTheBeast630. He will have you laughing and learning. I want to at least read one quote from the book so people like this. So this is the chapter on anyone can be racist, and racist really has a meaning, which I loved when I saw that that parenthetical statement, because I love to say words matter. And there's a couple liberals talking about, leftists, I'm sorry, but forgive me, liberals, talking about what racism is and how they have different flavors, like Baskin Robbins. Treating blacks especially well is well-meaning racism. Employing racial stereotypes, for example, of Italian or black criminals in the movies, is representative racism. Neutral tests like the SATs are part of institutional racism, and so on and so forth. And then there's a Dr. Nikki Lisa Cole who defined racism as any system of practices, beliefs, social relations, or phenomena that works in any way to produce a racial hierarchy, or that, this is my part, says, or that yields superiority, power, and privilege for some and oppression for others. So anything that yields a difference is racism.
Yep. Yeah, it's important that people understand this. When people see Dr. Ibram Kendi or Robin DiAngelo on television talking about how all of society is racist, they don't mean that all of society is run by people who dislike blacks or, for that matter, Caucasians. That hasn't been the case since the 50s. What they mean is that most social institutions produce results that are different across sex, across race, so on down the line. Like the NBA draft every year is mostly black guys and big white guys. There are no women. There are very few Asians. Racism.
Racist.
And racist. And the NHL draft, it's all whites from places where they have ice. What the hell? You know, but I mean, this is very serious stuff. I mean, Ibram Kendi argues that there are only two reasons that you ever see a gap between groups. One would be genetic inferiority, which he goes on to poetically reject for 7 or 8 pages. And the other would be racism. And the reality is that anyone who's talked to some of the people we know, Glenn Lowry, Shelby Steele, Tom Sowell, even just any quantitative scientist, white or black, knows that's nonsense. I mean, large groups that differ in things as important as residence and skin color also differ in a bunch of other stuff. What fields are people interested in? Mm-hmm. What's the median age?
Right.
Are blacks or Hispanics more likely to... Boom. Yeah. Fatherlessness. Yeah. All of this stuff. If you're looking at household income, you just hit on a big one. If you're looking at household income, it's going to have an effect if there's one less grown man in your household. So the reality is that this is a dumb idea. It doesn't even make any sense. Obviously, if you look at age, remember, we live more in the South, blacks and Hispanics, wages are lower. We make almost as much as whites in the South now, but wages are lower for everyone. Yep. If you adjust for all that stuff, almost all these gaps vanish. What you actually find, if you do this professionally, is like a 4 or 5% effect that's probably real racism. Mm-hmm. But the whole argument is remarkably weak.
So what do we do? Yeah. How do we address it?
How do we address? Well, I mean, how you address residual racism is that we all together fight
how do you address these crazy people who thinks everything that's racist? How do we address them? Push back against them?
I think just say things that are true. The Ibram Kendi argument is so easy to rebut that I'm amazed anyone takes it seriously. In fact, kind of ironically, but I might end on this, I think the reason people pretend to take it seriously is racism. I think the idea is that this guy's a black guy, he's on my side politically. We can't point out how dumb he sounds.
Like I thought I was pushing you to sum it up in a minute. You did it in like 26 seconds. That's 100% true. Follow this guy. He is amazing. Will the Beast 630. Buy his books, Hate, Crime, Hoax, and Taboo. 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. It has been a pleasure as always. Next time, I guess we need 2 hours because this still wasn't enough. Wilfred Reilly, appreciate you being on. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me on. As always, great. Bye.